In recent headlines, one terrifying phrase keeps resurfacing: World War III. With tensions rising between the United States and Iran and rockets raining down across the Middle East, people around the world are holding their breath. America has warships on alert. Iran is threatening retaliation. And behind all of this chaos, the name that keeps showing up in the middle of every news cycle: Israel. Whether it's airstrikes on Gaza, border clashes with Lebanon, or proxy battles involving Hezbollah and Iranian militias, the Israel-Palestine conflict has once again become the flashpoint for potential global disaster. But if we're going to understand where all this is heading, we need to understand where it all began. Because this isn't just a modern political dispute. It's a centuries-old struggle shaped by faith, history, colonization, displacement, and survival. So before we ask what happens next, let's ask what happened first. Historical roots before the 20th century. To understand the Israel-Palestine conflict, we have to go far back. Way before the 1948 war, before the Holocaust, even before the British Empire. The land we're talking about has been known by many names: Canaan, Judea, the Holy Land, Palestine, Israel. It sits at a literal and symbolic crossroads of civilizations, where Europe, Asia, and Africa meet, and where three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, find their roots. For ancient Jews, this land was the Promised Land, the kingdom of David and Solomon. For Muslims, it's home to Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. For Christians, it's where Jesus lived and died. Over thousands of years, the land changed hands, from Israelites and Romans to Byzantines, Islamic caliphates, crusaders, and the Ottoman Empire, which ruled it from the 1500s to the early 20th century. By the 1800s, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and its population was mostly Arab Muslims, alongside Christians and Jews who lived throughout the region. But then, two powerful movements began to rise. Zionism, a political movement by European Jews calling for a return to their ancestral homeland in Palestine. Fueled by centuries of persecution in Europe, especially in Russia, Poland, and later Nazi Germany, Jews began migrating to Palestine in increasing numbers. Arab nationalism. Among Arabs across the Middle East, a growing desire for independence and resistance to European colonization. Palestinian Arabs viewed the land as their own, passed down through generations. The early waves of Jewish immigration were small, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. As more land was purchased by Zionist groups, often displacing Arab farmers, resentment grew. So even before World War I, the seeds of this conflict were already sown, not just over borders or politics, but over land, identity, and historical memory. British rule in the Balfour Declaration, 1917-1947. By the early 20th century, the Middle East was undergoing a seismic shift. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled Palestine for centuries, was collapsing during World War I. Into the power vacuum stepped the British Empire, which took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate after the war. And that's where things got even more complicated. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, a short letter with massive consequences. It stated that the British government supported the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. To European Jews facing pogroms, anti-Semitism, and soon the rise of Nazism, this was a beacon of hope. For Palestinian Arabs, it felt like a betrayal. Why? Because at the same time Britain promised a homeland to Jews, it had also promised independence to Arab leaders during the war, if they helped fight the Ottomans. This double dealing planted the seeds of distrust and resentment that would only grow. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, driven by Zionist hope and European fear. Jewish settlers began buying land, often legally but many times from absentee landlords. Palestinian Arab farmers who had lived there for generations found themselves displaced, fueling a sense of injustice. Then came the 1936 Arab Revolt, a violent uprising against both British colonial rule and Jewish immigration. It lasted 3 years and was crushed by the British, who cracked down hard on Palestinian leadership. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were getting worse. As the Holocaust unfolded, Jews desperately sought escape. Many saw Palestine as their only hope. But Britain, fearing more unrest, restricted Jewish immigration, even turning away Holocaust survivors. This enraged Zionist groups, some of whom began fighting the British directly, calling them occupiers. By the end of World War II, Britain was stuck in an impossible situation. Palestinian Arabs demanded independence and an end to Jewish immigration. Jews demanded open migration in a sovereign state, especially after surviving genocide. Violence was spiraling, tensions were boiling, and Britain had no clear solution. So in 1947, exhausted and under pressure, the British government passed the issue to a newly formed global body, the United Nations. What happened next would split the region forever and trigger a war that still echoes today. The 1947 UN Partition Plan and the First Arab-Israeli War, 1948. By 1947, the British had had enough. Palestine was descending into chaos, bombings, riots, assassinations, and Britain, war-weary and overstretched, wanted out. They handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed a bold, controversial solution: partition. Palestine would be divided into 2 separate states: a Jewish state, an Arab state, and the holy city of Jerusalem would be placed under international control, since it was sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. The map was messy, awkward borders, overlapping populations, but the UN saw it as a compromise. And how did the people respond? Jewish leaders accepted the plan. After years of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust, many saw this as their only chance for a homeland. Not perfect, but necessary. Arab leaders rejected it. They argued, why should Arabs give up more than half their land to create a new state for people who had just recently arrived in large numbers? They saw the partition as colonial theft, an injustice imposed by outsiders. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders declared the creation of the State of Israel. And almost immediately, war broke out. 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded. They were expecting a quick victory. They were wrong. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, Israeli forces survived. They not only defended their new state, they expanded it, taking over more land than the UN plan had given them. By the time the armistice was signed in 1949, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. But the human cost was devastating. Around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced, either fleeing violence or forcibly expelled. Over 400 villages were destroyed or depopulated. Palestinians refer to this moment as the Nakba, or catastrophe. For Israelis, it's remembered as a heroic fight for independence and survival. This war created 2 competing narratives that still shape every conversation today: one of freedom and return, one of loss and exile. And perhaps most importantly, it created a massive refugee crisis with no resolution. The borders drawn in 1949 were not recognized by all. Jerusalem was divided. The West Bank came under Jordanian control. Gaza was under Egyptian control. But for Palestinians, there was no state, no sovereignty, no return. The conflict was no longer just about land. It was about memory, trauma, and unfinished promises. Occupation, Intifadas, and failed peace, 1967-2000s. Fast forward to 1967, just 2 decades after the founding of Israel, and the region is once again on the brink. Tensions between Israel and neighboring Arab countries, especially Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, had reached a boiling point. In a lightning-fast conflict known as the Six-Day War, Israel launched a preemptive strike. The result? A stunning military victory and a massive territorial shift. In less than a week, Israel captured the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria. It was a turning point. Israel had gone from a small, vulnerable state to a regional superpower, but it also became an occupying force, ruling over millions of Palestinians in territories they now controlled. And for Palestinians, this deepened their sense of dispossession. Now, they were not just stateless, they were also under military occupation. Over the years, Jewish settlements began popping up in the West Bank and Gaza. These were civilian communities, often subsidized by the Israeli government, built on what Palestinians considered their future homeland. This inflamed tensions even further. By 1987, the pressure exploded into the First Intifada, a mass Palestinian uprising marked by protests, boycotts, and street clashes. Kids throwing stones at tanks became global symbols of a people resisting occupation. Israel responded with force, curfews, arrests, home demolitions. The world was watching. Then, in the early 1990s, a moment of hope. The Oslo Accords, signed secretly in Norway and announced in 1993, were a breakthrough. Israeli and Palestinian leaders shook hands on the White House lawn, agreeing to work toward a two-state solution. For the first time, Palestinians were recognized as a political people, and the Palestinian Authority was formed to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza. But it didn't last. In 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, one of the architects of Oslo, was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. In the years that followed, trust broke down. Terror attacks by Palestinian militants, including Hamas, sparked brutal Israeli crackdowns. And in 2000, after peace talks collapsed, came the Second Intifada, a wave of suicide bombings, military raids, and bloodshed. Walls went up, borders hardened, dialogue ended, and the dream of peace began to fade. The situation today: blockades, settlements, and stalemate. Today, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains unresolved, deeply rooted, and some say, more entrenched than ever. Let's start with the Gaza Strip, home to over 2 million Palestinians, many of whom are descendants of refugees from the 1948 war. Since 2007, Gaza has been ruled by Hamas, a militant Islamist group that seized control from the Palestinian Authority. Israel, citing security concerns, imposed a land, air, and sea blockade, with support from Egypt. Gaza is now one of the most densely populated and impoverished places on Earth. Unemployment is high, clean water is scarce, electricity comes in a few hours a day. And when conflict erupts, as it has repeatedly in the past decade, civilians bear the brunt. On the other side, Israelis live with a constant fear of rocket attacks. Hamas and other groups frequently fire rockets into Israeli towns, prompting airstrikes and military operations in response. It's a cycle of violence that's become tragically familiar. Then there's the West Bank, a patchwork of Palestinian cities, Israeli settlements, and military zones. Over 700,000 Israeli settlers now live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, territories Palestinians hope to include in their future state. But here's the problem. These settlements are considered illegal under international law, a view Israel disputes, and they're spreading. Checkpoints, security barriers, and military presence divide the land and restrict movement for Palestinians. Many feel trapped in what they call a matrix of control. Meanwhile, the Palestinian leadership is deeply divided. The Palestinian Authority governs parts of the West Bank, but is seen as corrupt and ineffective. Hamas rules Gaza, but is labeled a terrorist group by Israel, the US, and others. So when peace is discussed, who speaks for the Palestinians? And from Israel's side, who's willing to make hard compromises after decades of bloodshed and trauma? Even international efforts have lost steam. The US, once the key peace broker, has shifted its priorities. Arab countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are normalizing ties with Israel without resolving the Palestinian issue. And through it all, ordinary people, Israeli and Palestinian, just want to live, work, and raise their families in peace. But as long as fear, inequality, and occupation persist, peace remains out of reach. So now we've seen the timeline, from ancient roots to partition, war, occupation, uprisings, and endless negotiations. The question remains, why can't this conflict be solved? The answer isn't simple, because the pain runs deep on both sides. For many Israelis, this land represents survival, a refuge after centuries of persecution, including the Holocaust. They see a nation built through struggle, surrounded by hostility, trying to defend itself in a dangerous region. For many Palestinians, this land represents loss of homes, freedom, and dignity. They live under occupation or blockade without a state of their own, watching settlements rise on land they believe is rightfully theirs. It's not just politics. It's identity. It's trauma. It's about two peoples with deep ties to the same land, and decades of reasons not to trust each other. And while peace agreements have been signed on paper, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Borders have hardened. Walls have gone up. Empathy has eroded. The global community often treats this as an unsolvable problem. But that's not true. It's just hard because it requires more than treaties. It demands courage, justice, and leadership. And yet, amid all this, there is hope. There are Israelis and Palestinians who work side by side in peace initiatives. There are families who have lost loved ones, but still fight for coexistence. There are young people on both sides who dream of something different. Not war, not vengeance, just a future. But dreams need action. And understanding the history, the roots, and the humanity behind this conflict is the first step. Because this isn't just about the Middle East. It's about how the world handles division, injustice, and identity. If we can't solve one of the most visible, longest-running conflicts on Earth, what does that say about the rest of us? So let this video be a spark, not just for knowledge, but for empathy. If you found this breakdown helpful, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me, what surprised you the most? And what do you think is the real path to peace? Thank you for watching, and stay informed.